Hello and welcome to this video, and today I'm going to be getting all proggy. We're going to be forgetting the jazz fusion and avant-garde jazz and free jazz and talking about another style of music that I absolutely love, which is progressive rock. Now in my career as a musician, it's been a genre that I have worked in as well as a drummer, and I've played in various progressive rock bands over the years. You know, I've played with IQ, I was a founder member of Frost. I've also done work with Magenta. I've got an album, one of the albums I played on the back, and my current progressive rock band of choice is Rain, which I formed with John Jowett, who also played with me in Frost and Magenta, and also my good mates Rob Growcut and Miron Webb. So I have a little bit of a history with prog. And I'm sure some of the people who have visited this channel have come here because they know me from some of the bands I've played in. So the whole time I've been doing this channel, I've been aware that at some point I need to dip my toe, and probably more than a dip, a big plunge into the fantastic world of progressive rock. And here's the first video to really tackle that genre. And today I'm going to be looking at my 10 favourite progressive rock albums, ranked from 10 to 1, with 10 being my least favourite of my favourites to 1 being my most favourite. Of course, they are all albums I absolutely love. These are the albums I grew up with, and this is the albums that really formed my musical appreciation. There's a couple of rules here I must tell you. I can't have a band in the top 10 twice, right? Because it would get so filled up with Yes and King Crimson and Genesis albums. You know, so many of my favourite albums are by bands like Yes, and I'm sure if I was being really honest about my favourite progressive rock albums, you'd probably get at least 4 or 5 Yes albums in there, maybe 4 Genesis albums, maybe 4 King Crimson albums. It'd be really difficult to do that. So I decided that once you're in, you don't get a second go. So it's almost like these are my favourite albums of each of the bands that I'm covering as well. The other one is that I've tried to not really, there's a few modern-ish albums in there, but it's really difficult when comparing an album that you've been listening to for 40 years to an album that you bought in the last 5 years, you know. So there's not that much modern stuff in here. I will try and get my teeth into modern progressive rock bands at some point, but these are real classic progressive rock bands, and that was my third rule. I said there was 2, but there's actually 3. And my third rule is they had to be proper progressive rock. So there's going to be no Miles Davis albums or Yellow albums, stuff which is on the fringes of prog, and we're not going to get into that argument about what is prog. I'm hoping that everything I put up will be stuff that you will all agree is full on prog. So I have gone on enough about this. Let's hit the top 10. So at number 10 I have, from 1978, UK's debut album. UK were a supergroup put together with Eddie Jobson, who played with, I think, Roxy Music, and Frank Zappa. John Wetton, who was the singer and bass player with King Crimson. I think he'd also been in Roxy Music. I think he spent a time with Family as well. The incredible Alan Holdsworth, the greatest guitarist that possibly ever lived on guitars. And one of the greatest progressive rock drummers of all time, Bill Bruford, on drums. This could have been a disaster. You know, this album came out in 1978. At that time, punk was raging. Everybody hated progressive rock. You know, most of the progressive rock bands like ELP and Yes and Genesis were either moving more towards pop music or just getting stuck and not knowing what to do. So it wasn't the best time to, you know, form a progressive rock band. They could have easily, you know, tried to do some new wave hybrid of progressive rock, but they didn't. They went on for a full-on progressive rock album, and this is one of the great progressive rock albums. Incredible playing, incredible sound. John Wetton, one of the great bass players and great voices in progressive rock. Eddie Jobson, absolute virtuoso keyboardist and violinist, and his violin really brings something to the band. I think, me being such a Mahavishnu Orchestra fan, any band with violin I tend to absolutely love. Bruford, of course, is at his peak here, you know, with his incredible signature sound, and on the top of that you have Alan Holdsworth, that usually, you know, elevates any album from here to up here, just with everything that he ever does. If you want to see what a fan I am of Alan Holdsworth, go and check out my video on him. It's full on prog. There's virtuosity. There's real heavy. There's no epics on here. I think the biggest epic is the 30 Years, which comes in at 8 minutes and Nevermore. So they're pretty epic. For me, it was In the Dead of Night. That was the track that sealed it for me, and that guitar solo on there. So yeah, at number 10, we have UK. Right, so I ummed and ahed about putting this band in because I used to play for them. I'm talking about IQ. I was IQ's drummer for between 2005 and I think 2009. I was in the band for 4 years. It was an incredible time. I really rate IQ as the best of the neo-prog bands, and there's some fantastic bands there, but I think IQ's, because they didn't go for the sort of, sword and sorcery, witches and wizards type of lyrics, that having the lyrical matter much more modern based, contemporary based, just gave them an edge, and they had such a signature sound, and they still have such a signature sound. And so I was so chuffed to get the gig with IQ because I was such a big fan of the band. I think they're one of the great, British progressive rock bands. When I joined the band, I then had to learn all the tracks, or as many as I could, so I had to go back and go through all the albums, and there's some incredible albums there. But there was one album that really stuck with me and has become one of my favourite albums and one of my favourite progressive rock albums, and that is Ever, which is also the first album to feature John Jowett, who is a good mate of mine. I'm working with him at the moment in the bands Quill and Rain. So yeah, perhaps I'm biased, but I'm sure if you go and check out this album, you'll see I'm not. There's something really special about this album. I think when IQ formed, they did some incredible progressive rock albums at a time when nobody was really in the mainstream that interested in people making like 25-minute tracks. But of course, in the early days, they had very limited budgets. IQ were having to their first albums was made themselves, and then they had they had to finance it themselves. Eventually, they got a major deal, and when they got the deal, they did two albums: I Sitting Comfortably and Non Zamo, which incredible production values, but lean more towards commerciality. They're really interesting albums, but they lean into sort of the 80s pop music at the time. When they finished with that deal, they reconvened and made this, and it's this return to progressive rock. Those who know the history of IQ knew that they'd before John joined, they had a guy called The Ledge who had committed suicide just before this album was made, and so it fills this album up with an emotionality that is rare in prog. It's a very intense and felt album. Darkest Hour, incredible. Fading Senses Out of Nowhere, Further Away, Leap of Faith and Came Down, all absolute brilliant. IQ at their utter best, but there's something about this album that for me, all the IQ albums are great, but there's something about it that just edges it over. There's a melancholy and an intensity to it. I think also John coming in had also gave him a kick up the bum. He was such a IQ fan when he joined as well, so I think it was just this magical time. They'd formed their own label. They'd gone back to making full-on prog. Pete, who had been in the early incarnation of IQ, had left, and then he'd come back, and I think that when I was in IQ, I realised that between Pete and Martin Orford and Mike, there's just a magical chemistry, and that's what keeps bands together for years and years. And I think there's still that chemistry there. Now, they brought back Tim Esau on bass. So yeah, at number 8, IQ, Ever, one of the great progressive rock bands of all time. Right, this is about the most modern album I've got in the list. And I nearly didn't put it in. I thought, you're not putting any other modern ones, so why would you put this in? But as time has come on, I've learned to really love this album. And that is Stephen Wilson, The Raven That Refused to Sing. I really like Porcupine Tree. I really like Steve's solo stuff. I think he's an absolutely fantastic musician who has done so much for progressive rock in terms of putting it on the map, and also, pushing the boundaries of what we consider progressive rock, which has kept the form alive. Without guys doing that, it will just all become tribute bands, and I will talk about this in another video. This one here, I think he's really staking a claim on progressive rock. You know, Porcupine Tree, very progressive, very Pink Floyd end of prog, but also there's a lot of heavy metal riffing later on. I know the early albums are less like that. This one, he goes wholeheartedly into progressive rock in terms of the themes and the sounds and the darkness. And although he is wearing his influences on his sleeve on this one, I find he's forged a completely unique sound here. It's definitely Steven Wilson. The band is absolutely incredible. It's Marco Minneman on drums, Guthrie Govan on guitar. You've got Adam Holtzman on keyboards. I'm getting old, I'm having to use the memory. Theo Travis on flute and saxophone, and the great Nick Beggs on bass. And they're all signature players, are all absolutely the top of their game. Really, really amazing album. It's just so full on prog. It's like Steve Wilson goes, right, you guys, you want me to make a prog album? Well, here's a prog album. And it's really redefined prog for me. And I found I've gone back to it many a time, when I wanted a bit of inspiration, that you could still make a modern album that's relevant, which is still dripping with progressive rock, which I think you can. And so, yeah, there it is at number 7. Right. At number 6, I have Jethro Tull, Songs of the Wood. Now, for me, when I was growing up, because we really get into the classic progressive rock bands, I was a huge Yes fan, I was a huge Genesis fan, I was a huge King Crimson fan. I wasn't so much a fan of Jethro Tull, and even less of a fan of Pink Floyd and ELP. And I warn you now, Pink Floyd and ELP do not make my list today. I wasn't overly keen on the sort of ELP overblownness. I really like the first album. Tarkus I like Trilogy. I'm not so keen on Brain Salad Surgery, although it's got its moments of greatness. But for me, it wasn't the same as Yes and Genesis. With Pink Floyd, I really like Echoes. I really love the Syd Barrett stuff. Dark Side Moon's great. I don't dislike it. It's just not quite the same for me. I found Pink Floyd were a little bit, they never get out of second gear, really. Sacrilegious, but that's the way I am, Jethro Tull, on the other hand, I really did like, but I didn't go out and get all the albums. I really like Stand Up, really like that album. But for me, the thing I love about Jethro Tull is that sort of a rock band playing like English folk madrigals. I just love that sound. And they do that on so many different albums, but I feel they really do it well on here. This really is that sort of English aesthetic. I had this on the car with my kids the other day, and we ended up taking a detour through the English countryside, and it's a joy to drive through the English countryside, listen to these songs of the wood. And my kids really enjoyed it when we were getting into sort of the enclosed lanes and with the trees going over and it goes dark, and we had Jethro Tull, and they said, "Oh, this is great, Dad, we love this," The other thing about this album is Barrymore Barlow. I'm a drummer. Barrymore Barlow's drumming on here. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. It's some of the greatest progressive rock drumming ever recorded. He's an absolute beast. Some of the complexity on here is just breathtaking. You can't believe a rock band can create music like that. It's absolutely incredible. And what makes it more interesting is that there are other bands that went down that route. I'm thinking of Gentle Giant and Griffin. But they never had the success of Jethro Tull. Jethro Tull were a stadium rock band. They're one of the biggest rock bands in the world. How making albums like this is absolutely incredible. They got such a signature sound. Ian Anderson's got such a fantastic voice, and it's so unique. One of the things in progressive rock I love, and you get this even more than I find in fusion, is each musician on the whole is an absolute individual. If you compare Bill Bruford to Barrymore Barlow to Phil Collins, if you can compare those drummers, they are absolutely completely different. And Ian Anderson and John Anderson, Peter Gabriel, absolutely completely different. And I find it absolutely wonderful. It's an incredible genre. I am going to do a video which really argues about how incredible prog is, because I think it gets a bashing from the critics. So yes, which is this, I think this is number 6, isn't it? So at number 6, I hope that's right, that's 10, no. Oh, actually, I think this is number 7, isn't it? So at number 7, we have Songs of the Wood by Jethro Tull. Brilliant album. At number 6, I don't have the album here, and I'll tell you why. At number 6, I've got the album Freehand by Gentle Giant. Now, I don't own any Gentle Giant albums. When I was a kid growing up, I never bought any Gentle Giant and didn't know what they were sounding like. It wasn't until I was actually working in the prog world that I thought, well, I'll go and check a couple of these bands out. And I can remember getting a couple of listening online to Gentle Giant, and I was like, oh my God, why did I never listen to this? Now I'll tell you why I didn't, is because I can remember picking up Gentle Giant albums, and I thought, judging by the albums covers, that I wouldn't like them. This is back in the day when this is how you had to decide whether you were going to buy an album. And I can remember I looked at a couple of them. I never think, except for Octopus, which has got a brilliant album, I always felt they were a little bit let down by their album covers. I think if they'd had greater album covers, I may have bought them. But Freehand for me is listening to them all, and I've gone through all the Gentle Giant albums. I've listened to them for the last 10, 15 years now. Obviously, I own them digitally. I really should go and get a copy of Freehand, because it is my favourite one. I went to get it the other day. There's a Steve Wilson remix of it. It was very expensive, and I ended up not getting it, but I will get it at some point. But yeah, the Freehand for me, when I went through the catalogue, which I did very quickly, I sort of had a massive 6-month binge on Gentle Giant. When I got to that one, the thing about it was just so funky. Gentle Giant are like Jethro Tull. They're like a rock band that seems to mine that sort of English, magical English aesthetic absolutely fantastically. Their virtuosity is just breathtaking. I think in terms of composition and instrumental virtuosity, they may be the greatest progressive rock band there ever was. But the thing that gets me about Gentle Giant is they're just so funky. And I think they hit the funky peak on Freehand. It's got a touch of the jazz fusions about it, but it's unlike any jazz fusion that we could cover. It's not like Weather Report or Mahavishnu. It's its own thing. Gentle Giant are their own thing, but yeah, Gentle Giant, the way they arrange their music, which is they often use a compositional method where they will take a melody and they will pass that melody around the band very quickly. And they also do this vocally as well, so you often get sort of very quick question and answer phrases, and they move this around the band very quickly. They're absolutely virtuoso at this. By the time they get to Freehand, their sound is so well developed that they're absolutely at their peak. I think if you go through the Gentle Giant albums and go through, they start off a jaw-dropping level, but they're still developing their sound. I feel that when John Weathers joins the band, which I think is on Power and the Glory, at that point, or is it Octopus? I'm sure there's some Gentle Giant fans are going to be questioning my knowledge here. But they're incredible right up. I think Three Friends almost could well be my second favourite Gentle Giant album. But John Weathers isn't on that. When John Weathers comes in, his approach, which is actually very simplistic, seems to elevate the band up more. And I think it's not that their compositional style is not developed on the early albums. It's just that they develop it even more. And they manage to create prog epics that are only 5 or 6 minutes long. This is one of the things really interesting about Gentle Giant, is they're not one of those bands that goes in for 20-minute tracks, but they seem to pack it all in. So yes, at 6, we have Freehand by Gentle Giant. Right. At number 5, and now we're just dealing with absolute sublime albums. Right. So at number 5 we have my favourite Genesis album, which I think has to be Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. It's not an easy decision. Foxtrot could be there, Selling England could be there, Nursery Crimes could be there for me. You know, I'm also really partial to the live album Three Sides Live, because it was the first Genesis album I ever got, and it just blew me away. And the medley, the In the Cage medley on that album was my first introduction to sort of proggy Genesis, and it just absolutely blew me away. I find it hard to believe that's actually different tracks put together, because it's compositionally so incredible. But I think this one just has the edge over all the others, and I think a lot of people would agree with me there. This is one of the truly greatest progressive rock albums ever. Genesis are at their absolute peak at this point, and I think the swapping of that sort of English historical subject matter for a much more street American subject matter, but still very surreal, I think differentiates this album from all the others and really puts it in its own bracket, and I think Genesis are better for that. It's still very English, it's still very quirky and weird, but I think having that American slant in there just elevates it for me. I think this album's made in 1974. I think Phil Collins has become enamoured with the Mahavishnu Orchestra and Weather Report, and he's playing like he's in the Mahavishnu Orchestra on here. You know, you hear that sound, and I think there's a funkiness to this as well that you don't necessarily get so much with the other Genesis albums. It's a conceptual album with a story that runs from beginning to end. It's full on prog. It does everything. You know, when you open up, anyone who have the vinyl will remember that there's this huge story that you could follow inside. It's full on prog. It's an absolute masterpiece. But even though it's like that, you can take any one of these songs out, and they're absolutely greatest hits. Genesis at their peak. Absolutely brilliant album. So that was number 5, wasn't it? At number 4, I have You by Gong. Now, I've already done some videos on Gong, and you can go and check them out. Gong really is one of my favourite progressive rock bands. They seem to occupy their own world. You know, they're not quite like the Canterbury bands, but they got that thing going on. They're not quite like Yes or Genesis. They have their own world, and it's a full-on trippy world. This, of course, is part 3 of the Flying Teapot trilogy. I would love to put all them 3 in, but if I was to do that, this would probably maybe go up to much higher near the top spot. If you want to, you know, hear me talk about this at length, then go and check out my video on the Flying Teapot trilogy. But this is absolutely incredible. The thing that always blows me away about this album is it's made in 1974. You put it on, it sounds like it could be made now. The influence on dance music and trance music and modern fusion, I think, is underestimated. This just sounds so modern. It's like one big track, you know, which is really interesting. It's supposedly got 8 songs on it, but they all flow into each other, and the whole thing moves from one to the next, and it is so mind-blowing. This is probably the most psychedelic trippy album on my list. So yeah, at number, what is it, 4, Gong You. And if you haven't heard this, go and check it out now. And Fusion fans, if you haven't heard this, go and check it out now. It's absolutely mind-blowing. Incredible jazz on there, you know. So at number 4, this was a difficult one, because it's not necessarily their most proggy album, but I think I would have to put it in there because it's still pretty prog, and that is Rush, Moving Pictures. I've done a video already on Rush and gone through my favourite albums. This would have been number 1. It's an absolute masterpiece. It's probably one of the very first progressive rock albums I ever bought, this and the Yes album. I think I may have bought this even before I bought the first Yes album. Really concise and quite commercial, but still with tracks like, you know, side 2 seems to be a little bit more proggy. Now, yeah, Farewell to Kings, 2112, Hemispheres, those are the full-on prog albums. I absolutely love them, and I nearly put Farewell to Kings in place of this, but I've just got to be honest that this really opens the door to that second phase of prog, which is all the prog that's come up after the sort of classic phase. This is one of the greatest albums of the 1980s. It's one of the biggest selling albums of the 1980s. I'm going to do a video that really argues the case for prog and shows how it didn't go away in 1977 when punk happened. In fact, it's still carried on informing, and that its DNA is so much in all sorts of music, especially British pop music. You can really see the DNA, and I'm really looking forward to doing that video. But suffice to say, here is an album that really exemplifies that. You know, it's still a huge album to this day, and here we have, what is it, 1981, a full-on progressive rock album just owning the 1980s. So never let anyone tell you it went away. It just changed. Right. So that was at number 3. So I'm now at number 2. At number 2, I have Red by King Crimson. I absolutely love King Crimson. I would say Yes and King Crimson, my 2 favourites. Progressive rock band, so you can obviously guess what's going to be at number 1. King Crimson, what can we say? I love the first album, but the albums that came after that, they're not my favourite progressive rock albums. When Fripp reforms with this band, which is with Bill Bruce and John Wetton, and early with David Cross, Jamie Muir, he changes the sound of prog. He makes it darker and, you know, more menacing, heavier. This is like Black Sabbath fused with John Coltrane. You know, this is a heavy album, and I really love the later albums that they made. So this is a difficult one for me. The reason why this gets to number 1 is I think it's the most fully formed. You know, so Lark's Tongues and Aspic is a wonderful album, but they're still trying to find their sound a little bit, and they go off down all sorts of little rabbit holes, which are really interesting rabbit holes. It really is one of the great albums. The second album, Stars of the Bible Black, there's a lot of improvisation, and that's really, really interesting. They bring in this really improvised element into it, you know. On this album, they seem to pull all those elements together and add more elements. And it contains one of the greatest epics ever, which is Starless, which is, I think, could well be my favourite progressive rock track of all time. So yeah, number 2, King Crimson, Red. Right, so at number 1, and I think for many people this is the greatest progressive rock album of all time, Close to the Edge by Yes. Absolute achievement in music. And I think we have to put Yes in there because they're one of the biggest selling progressive rock bands of all time. But despite the millions that they sold and the huge cultural space they occupy in rock music, what's interesting for me is how unremittingly dense this album is, how uncompromising it is. You know, this album has got 3 tracks on it. It's got the track Close to the Edge, which is nearly 20 minutes long, and then it's got 2 10-minute tracks. You can't just slip it on and, you know, check out. Let's just check out the first song, see if there's some hooks there, see if I'm going to like it. It's not like that. This album requires time, you know. Now, when I was older and more sophisticated, I stopped listening to progressive rock. And I got into all sorts of much more extreme jazz, and then I got interested in sort of like thrash metal, experimental metal, and I've been chatting about people like John Zorn and Bill Laswell. And around that time I felt I was too sophisticated to listen to prog. And then one day, probably about 15, 20 years ago, I thought, oh, I'll have another listen to some prog. I haven't listened to some prog. And I pulled this album out and I put on And You and I. And it blew me away so much. It was still so heavy and way out there and yet so beautiful that I can remember just sat staring at the speakers going, why did I forget about this? This is the most incredible music ever made. And it is, you know. Yes, at this point are at their peak. It's just before Bill Bruford left and Alan White came in. I love the Alan White stuff, you know. Going for the One and Relayer are 2 of the greatest progressive rock albums of all time. And if I could have put other Yes albums into the list, they would have made it, along with Fragile and the Yes album. I would have had to have all those in. They're all incredible, and they're all vying. They're so close to the genius of this. But I think this is the point where progressive rock is at its peak. Not just Yes, but progressive rock as the genre is at this, you know. And it's just a monumental album. So that is my top 10 progressive rock albums of all time. I'm going to be doing a lot more videos on prog, so keep them peeled, your eyes that is, because I will have some more videos out later in the week on prog. And if you like this, like it, and if you want to hear more, subscribe, and most importantly, drop some stuff in the comments. You know, I'm hoping that some of the closet proggers who aren't so much fusion fans who've been watching my channel have been waiting for this moment, and I'm hoping they're all going to steam in and tell me all the mistakes I made factually, because you know what prog fans are like. They like the facts correct. I'm worried about my Gentle Giant knowledge. I'm pretty sure, I'm not too sure when the first John Weathers albums. I failed. I'm sorry, proggers. I failed you. I failed you. I knew my Achilles heel would be Gentle Giant. I'm a new listener. I've only been listening to them for 10, 15 years. I do apologise for that. So, and I'm sure I've made some other errors, and I do apologise. I make these videos are just off the top of my head. It's whatever happens. So yeah, put some comments in. Tell me where I went wrong. Tell me about your favourite progressive rock albums. Tell me about all the people I missed out. All those obscure bands like Egg and National Health and Magma and Can and Peter Hamill and Van de Graaff's Generator. Where were they? I'm so sorry. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here. See you soon, and check out the next video. Thank you. Bye.